So the next thing we're going to do is hook up the oil lines, but before we get started, I'd like to talk about what spots on the oil tank are for, and also where the fittings on your motor go to.
It's something you don't want.
Welcome to another edition of Saturday Sportster. So first off, the oil tank just has bungs on the top and the bottom. So there's two on the top, two on the bottom, and they're just through holes. So these two bungs aren't different from each other. They're just at the top. So you can use them as either a return line or a vent line. It doesn't matter which one. It's however you want to route it and what looks nicest. It's just important that your return and your vent both go to the top of the tank. Same as the bottom, there's two bungs in the bottom of your tank and they both go to the bottom, so both of them can be used as a drain or a feed line. It doesn't matter which one, it's whatever looks nicer and how you're going to route it. Usually I would use the front as your feed, because so your line isn't going to overlap over your drain. But say if you want to run the feed going that way and it's easy for the drain to be here, you can do that also. It's just drain and feed have to be on the bottom, return and vent are on the top, and that's the only difference between the bungs at the top or the bottom. For where they go on your motor, there's a few fittings on your motor that you need to deal with. This being a 69, there's the feed and the return are on the top, and then your vents can actually differ per year range. On this one, I think I have a mixed up cover for the model year of this bike, so I actually have two vents that I have to figure out. So I have a vent on the top for the motor trans that's going to vent my motor and cases, and then I also have one on the cam cover that also would go to the oil tank. And so I'm gonna actually, since I have two of them, instead of just the one that you would normally see on a Sportster, I'm gonna tie those together going to the vent to the oil tank. So I'm gonna show you that now. So the first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna put my drain plug in. I figured I'm gonna put it in the back one because I'm gonna actually run the feed going forward. So I'm gonna use the back as my drain so the feed doesn't overlap the drain, and I'm gonna have to wiggle it out of the way to pull my drain plug out when I wanna drain the oil. I'm using brass plugs and fittings just because this tank's steel. These are non-ferrous. I had using steel ones before. I've had them seize up, and I don't know, I don't mind the look of the brass, so that's what I chose on this bike. And so I'm putting the drain in, and I also am using plumber's tape on the pipe fittings. And now I'm going to run the feed, and I want the feed to end up pointing forward. So I'm running these in, and I got a wrench handy to snug it up after it gets tight. I'm going to also I don't know if it's going to make it one more rotation. Is it going to? I hope so. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, sweet. Okay, I think that's really good. All right, and now I'm gonna put the vent is a smaller fitting. I'm gonna put that on the front bung, because then I'm also, like I told you, to tie my two vents together, I made a Y fitting that I'm gonna connect just with some rubber hose so that both of the vents actually can vent all the way up and then drain back down to their respective locations. So I'm not actually mixing the two vents. So I'm gonna run the smaller one in front. we go. And now the same for my return, and this is the return because it's a larger diameter hose. Okay. So because of the mix-up of the model years and it having 2 vents instead of 1, I couldn't really determine what was the best way to handle that, whether to plug a vent or to actually have 1 vent to atmosphere. Making the Y like this, I'll be able to get both of the vents into the oil tank, and since the splice is going to happen so high above where the parts are venting at, that if they spray up oil, they won't actually mix oil from like the transmission to the cam cover, because they'll be able to drain back into their respective locations. So this was the best solution for this kind of mix match of parts that I was able to figure out. So I made this out of just aluminum tubing, bent a couple pieces and welded them together, and we're going to just attach this in this location. So I'm going to attach this to the barb, and I don't know if you've ever used safety wire before, but I think it's a really clean look for attaching, because then you don't have that big worm clamp of a hose clamp and the big like screw and stuff, and I just think it's just a much cleaner look to see the twisted up wire. It also looks very vintage. You got to be careful though, because there's a lot of spinning parts when you're doing this. So you definitely have to be careful around your paint. It can get a little tricky. Yeah, I think that's nice. If you're doing it like this, you cut them back, and you can use your safety wire pliers, but I prefer to grab some needle nose. You're going to want to twist it back on itself, and then you'll bend it one way or the other. I think that's tight enough. There you go. And then I'm going to leave it just like that, and we're going to run the rest of our lines. And now, since we have the fittings on the oil tank, we can run the lines from the actual fittings on the motor up to the top, and we know exactly where to cut them. But I want to start down here because it might be a little tricky to route them nicely into this area. So we're going to start on the other side running our oil lines, and then we're going to run them up to our fittings. So before we get started, this is going to be kind of hard to manage, all this hose, so I'm going to just kind of rough cut a few of these to get it a little bit more manageable, and then we'll only have to cut off, say, an inch or so after we figure out exactly how long they need to be. So this one is the return, this is the feed, like I mentioned before. So I think I'm going to start with figuring out how the return's going to route. And you can leave it long. I might even just make it a little bit long. I got plenty of 3/8. I only got one more line to use. All right, and then so I might actually just attach that. Should get some pliers to pull this on. There we go. All right. Yeah. Okay, so I got this on here and I'm gonna route this up, and this is gonna be going to our return because it's the front fitting. So I'm gonna lay that out. All right, that's going to the top of the tank because it's the return, and I like how that's kind of laying out in there. I think that'll be nice and tucked in and real clean. And then since I got the area kind of open, I'm gonna try to feed in my other vent. And since that has a tight bend, I think I'm gonna have to clamp that on to make the bend. But I cut that pretty evenly. I think I can remove a little bit more. That was a pretty good guess. And I'm gonna go to one of these fittings, and now I have to, that one won't stay because it's on a straight. But now I can lay out the other vent from the cam cover. So we're gonna stick this on here. And this will look nice coming right over the top, just like the other one. And we're gonna leave this long, just like before. And once we get these attached on the motor, then I'll go to the other side of the bike and we'll actually route them nice and maybe try to connect them. And then, so I'm gonna cut this about here. And then I'm gonna connect everything on the motor side. Okay. So I routed this nicely and kind of jammed it in this spot to try to hide it a little bit and make it just a clean spot right back into the cam cover. And so now I'm gonna safety wire this one in place. Same as before, I'm just cutting it and I'm gonna loop it back into itself. Just try to make it so you're not gonna, something out, just out in space to stab you if you reach down in there for when you're working sometime. And being by the chain, it'll get full of grease and whatnot under there if you, be a hard place to try to keep clean, and you'll reach down in there and stab yourself on this thing if you don't do this. Just tuck that up out of the way and kind of try to twist it. It can gotta be a pain, but it's worth it. Yeah, details. You got some little loop. Okay, now that's off. And now I'm going to, I gotta sneak a little bit of wire around that guy. I need to try to sneak it in there. Lots of jammed in this little area. I think I gotta do this on the other side though. Push down all the way. I think that's okay. That one might be kind of tricky to get off in the future. This looks pretty nice. Put that one on top. Feed. I'm gonna go just a little bit extra, but about there. And then we're gonna put that on, and then I'm gonna hook up everything on the other side. Maybe tape them together just to make them look nice. There we go. Let's get a cutter to jam on there. Use some pliers to pull it on. There we go. This is a better angle, maybe. We gotta grab it closer. There we go. All right, that looks nice. There's definitely a lot of ways to get your hoses from point A to point B, and you might want to just mess around with the routing and how you're going to actually, you know where it's got to go. If you don't remember where they got to go, it might be nice to mark them with blue tape of like what's the vent, what's the return, just what location they got to be in. I can see these, they're right on top, so I don't really need to mark them, and I remember where they got to go, so it's like I can see the fitting from point A to point B, so I don't have to mark them. But if you can't visualize the routing of your hoses and stuff like that, it might be nice for you to track it down and then mark it or do something like that to make it easy for yourself. But the way I route them is, honestly, I'm just kind of just wiggling these around until they look nice, and I'm pleased with how they kind of get from one spot to another. There's nothing really, any tricks, anything like that. Just try to make it clean. And so I think I like that, and I might actually just add a couple zip ties just to hold them together. And so I'm going to start putting these in their places. So I'm going to go here, and I can actually cut these to length now. I'm going to go there, cut this to length. And this goes to this fitting, and this is my feed, my gravity feed. So that's gonna tuck down there. I like how that looks. This is the first. That one's gonna smush a little. Maybe that's there. I like that. That's gonna be there. And that goes to the front fitting. So that's my return. And then I have my two vents to deal with. Let's get these kind of out of the way. And I want to tuck this kind of in there. I feel like, yeah, I'm gonna put this one in the front. Actually, I'll go like that. This one in the front. actually, I want that to be, I'm going to take a little bit of material out of that. These are a really great tool if you don't know about them for getting hoses off of barbs, because they can be real sticky. And it can be really tough without the proper tool. Take a little bit of slack out of that. And I think that looks pretty good. Nice lines coming down. I think I might change this actually. And now that we got everything ran, I'm just going to finish safety wiring those into place. So as you can see, I kind of changed up the oil lines a little bit. After mounting that T up here, it just looked really hokey and I didn't like it. But sometimes you need to do that to figure out what's going to look best for your bike. So after I came up with that, then I was able to figure out that if I moved it down just a little bit, I could hide it. And now it looks way better and just a much cleaner look, especially with the classic, just 2 lines coming up to the tank and not being so busy with the 3. But I'm pleased with this and this is how it's going to be. And so just don't be afraid to kind of try a few different things to make your oil lines look the best. You can run them any which way that you want. The only thing that needs to happen is your vent and return line go to the top of the tank and your feed comes from the bottom. Anything else is however you want it to look on your bike. So I hope that helps you run your oil lines. So there's one thing I wanted to talk about were the vent lines. So previously I mentioned that I had linked these 2 vent lines together because I had one coming out of the top of the case, one coming out of the cam cover. But after we filmed this, I did a little bit of research and I figured out the difference in the years. XLHs would come out of the cam cover and then XLCHs would come out of the top. The difference being in the late 60s, whether they had electric start or not. And so I learned that from my research that these 2 vents actually vent to the same cavity in your motor, so you don't have to run both of them, you can just run one. I don't mind how this looks, so I'm gonna actually keep both of them, but that's what I was able to determine was that these vents actually vent to the same cavity in the motor, and so you only need to run one of these up to your oil tank. So this little cluster of hoses coming up to the oil tank was kind of just floating out a little bit, so I just rerouted the feed line to the outside of this cluster, which actually puts a little bit of pressure to pull this in and keep everything nice and tidy. And I just kind of clamped them together with some zip ties just to make it really nice flowing from the oil tank to the motor. Ba 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 ba.